Hi, and welcome to another edition of Ontology Talk. Today, I have the honor of welcoming Professor Lauri Karttunen to the show. Dr. Karttunen has worked in the areas of linguistic semantics and computational linguistics. He's been a professor at UT Austin and now Stanford's Center of the Study of Language and Information, as well as in industry at both SRI and Xerox PARC. He is also a fellow of the Association of Computational Linguistics and a recipient of its Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome, Dr. Karttunen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great to have you here. So I thought maybe we could start with just an overview or introduction from you. What is, in your words, the field of linguistic semantics?
Well, it's a study of meaning. It's a study of relations like entailment, contradiction, presupposition.
Okay, and I guess this is quite different in many ways from what a lot of people are doing today with distributional semantics is one thing, I guess it's called. And you've really been focused, I think, maybe earlier in your career on sort of explicit or curated or manually created meaning. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. I have not done any statistical studies, any word embeddings.
Yeah.
So I'm purely symbolic semanticist.
Right. So can we elaborate a little bit on some of these things? So you talked a bit about entailment. How do things like entailment help you get at the meaning of language? And what does entailment look like, for example?
Well, entailment is a relation between sentences or propositions, if you want to be technical. So John managed to solve the problem entails that John solved the problem. John managed to solve the problem. John didn't solve the problem. It's a contradiction.
Okay. Yeah, or maybe John emptied the bucket, so therefore the bucket must be empty. All these things that sort of language builds in to its constructs that people take for granted, but we have to make explicit for machines to be able to understand them.
Right.
Okay, great. So going back, looking at your career, maybe we could kind of start at the beginning and say, who were some of the people that influenced your career, especially in your formative years? Who are some of the giants of science on whose shoulders you've stood on?
Well, Jim Macaulay, Barbara Partee, Montague.
Montague, in fact. Wow. Can you say a little bit about some of your experiences with Montague and how he helped shape your career?
Well, Montague really changed the whole field of linguistic semantics. I think now everybody is doing what in the beginning was called Montague semantics, which involved, he brought into natural language semantics all the tools of formal semantics that philosophers had worked for a long time. So in the beginning, it was called Montague semantics, but everything now is Montague semantics. So Montague has sort of dropped into the background.
So all of the approach to specifying the meaning of language with logical expressions that I'm used to. So before Montague, I guess that wasn't prevalent, is what you're saying?
Not in semantics as it was practiced by linguists. Of course, logicians have already had Montague semantics for a long time.
So this is a good example of how fields proceed along their separate paths, and people in one field may not even be aware of things in another field that are even taken for granted, it sounds like.
Right.
Yeah, because I'm certainly used to reading about Frege and Wittgenstein and their discussions about how to represent language in logic, but I guess those people that were studying language per se instead of philosophy weren't used to that.
Right. Frege was really quite unknown among linguists until rather recently. He was sort of discovered.
And did you have actual, sort of lots of face-to-face interaction with him, or are you talking about his influence on you just from reading his work?
Yeah, I met Montague once, had a curious discussion with him. we were sitting next to each other at a table, and I introduced myself. He said, "Well, what are you teaching?" And I said, "Well, I'm teaching semantics right now." And he said, "Well, what kind of semantics?" I said, "Well, I just gave my students a final exam, and one of the questions was John failed to manage to solve the problem." And question was, did John solve the problem? And if so, how does the sentence mean that? And if he didn't solve the problem, what does the sentence, what is the interpretation of the sentence in that case? He said, "Well, obviously, John managed to solve the problem doesn't mean either one of those things." So because he never has studied the meanings of individual words like manage or fail that take sentential complements. He was much more interested in quantifiers and other aspects of the meaning without kind of really studying this sort of semantic problems that I was focusing on.
So that sounds more like you were influencing him.
Well, I don't think so.
Well, I wish there'd been more overlap then, because it sounds like you were able to at least point out to him a new area to apply his technique, or at least a different area of language.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that he died so early.
Well, you also mentioned Barbara Partee.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell me about your experiences with her.
Well, I first met him at UCLA. I was at the Rand Corporation for a year. Rand Corporation was located in Santa Monica. And so I often went to Barbara's class at UCLA and had many discussions with her. So she's been my good friend ever since. We first met in 1966. That was the year when I was at Rand.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about the sort of research connection there. What topics were most important where she was able to help you in your study?
Well, Barbara was at UCLA. She was the colleague of Montague, who was also at UCLA. And it was really through Barbara that Montague's influence spread among linguists. So it was Barbara who created the field of Montague semantics. That was the name that she gave to it. And that's now the dominant take on semantics among linguists.
Oh, fascinating. So it's really the disciple of Montague that created Montague semantics, or named it. Maybe he was too humble to name it after himself.
Yes, it was Barbara who gave it that name.
And has the use of logic since that point changed a lot? I mean, has it sort of broadened into different logics? Was it primarily just propositional or first order when Montague was sort of promoting his theories initially?
No, Montague was not a first order person. His intentional logic, of course, was a higher order logic.
Interesting, because I often think that of logics proceeding to greater levels of expressiveness, and that the world started out with Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Just simple sort of linguistic propositions, and it's taken, then Frege came along, gave us first order logic in this grossly simplified history, and then other people developed modal and higher order logics from there. But you're saying that at least in linguistics, Montague kind of leapfrogged ahead and picked a more expressive or more sophisticated logic right from the start.
Right. So for Montague, if you take over just the proper name like John, the meaning of John in Montague semantics is the sort of function from all possible worlds to the set of properties that John has in that world.
So was he already bringing in Kripke's ideas? Because you're talking about possible worlds.
Yes.
Okay, so that's amazingly way ahead of where I thought things would have started. They started from a very expressive point. You've also more recently in your career done quite a bit of computational linguistics work. And this does seem also like a kind of logical progression to me of, creating theories and then finding a way to automate them in software. Can you tell me a little bit about that transition, if in fact I've related it accurately? What prompted it, how did it go, and what were the stages of migration in your career from maybe more less computational to more computational?
Well, I got into computation just from the other end of linguistics, not from semantics, but morphology. I was always interested in how to do morphology because being a Finnish it's a very complicated language. Looking at the morphological side, and so I was working together with Martin Kay and Ron Kaplan, both at the Xerox PARC Research Center. And what I did in morphology is very much inspired by the two of them. They had proved that in spite of all appearances, rules describing morphological alternations actually are regular in the mathematical sense of regular, which means that they can be implemented by finite state transducers. And so that's how I got into computational linguistics. I took that idea from Martin Kay and Ron Kaplan and spent quite a bit of time on creating an implementation, a compiler that would take morphological rewrite rules, type of Chomsky-Halle rules, and convert them, compile them into a finite state transducer.
And that happened, that transition in your focus, I take it, happened at PARC, or was it before PARC, and the reason for going to PARC?
It happened at PARC, and I had been working with Martin Kay and Ron Kaplan before, so that was actually the reason for my transition from SRI, where I studied, to PARC.
Yeah, it's fascinating that the number of people and the volume of great work that has come out of Xerox PARC. I mean, it's really central to the history of Silicon Valley, especially, I guess, in scope that not only were they hiring visionary computer scientists, but they were also hiring, foundational formal linguists like yourself, and then using that knowledge to cross-fertilize computational implementations.
PARC had at one point a really great linguistics team. There were about a dozen people working there in a group led by Ron Kaplan.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I've had a couple of chances to talk with Ron, a really fascinating and inspiring individual that I think must have inspired a lot of others as well.
Yes.
Can you say more about that environment at Xerox PARC, especially early on in your tenure there? What was the environment like? I mean, it sounds like there must have been a lot of great people and a lot of great freedom to develop new ideas and run with them.
Yeah, PARC was a Lisp environment. So everything that I did at PARC was done in Lisp. And later on, working at the Xerox Research Center in Europe, in Grenoble, in France, I did a lot of just rewriting the PARC system in C to make it faster and more efficient.
Can you say more about the environment, the human environment at PARC back in those early years? What was it like, and other people that may have come through the lab?
Well, I mostly worked with Ron Kaplan and Danny Bobrow. They were the kind of closest people to me. We were all in the same little team. And Ani Säänen was there as well, of course.
And hopefully I can interview her in the future as well. We'll pause the conversation there and return in our next video for part 2 of my interview with Dr. Lauri Karttunen.